I stood in front of my own car dealership, watching my brother-in-law try to force the doors open with forged documents, while his attorney claimed the business now belonged to him. He had no idea I'd already been sitting behind the tinted windows of my car for 3 hours with the police and my own lawyer, watching everything unfold. My name is Stephanie Roth. I'm 42 years old, and I built my car dealership over 15 years from a single-use car in a rented parking lot into one of the largest independent dealerships in the region. This is a story about how my own family tried to steal everything I'd built, and how their plan completely backfired. My brother Kevin was always the talented one in our family, at least in our parents' eyes. He studied business administration, while I dropped out of school at 19 to earn money after our father lost his job. Kevin married an ambitious woman named Diana, who quickly realized that Kevin's actual career mostly consisted of failed investments and empty promises. She needed someone who actually made money, and she didn't find that person in her own husband. I started my business with $27,000 in savings and an old Toyota I repaired and resold at a small profit. Over the following years, I reinvested every cent, worked 16 hours a day, and taught myself everything about auto mechanics, financing, and customer relations because I couldn't afford consultants. By 30, I had a small sales lot with 8 vehicles. By 35, I owned my own property with a repair shop and 12 employees. By 40, Roth Automotive was one of the most respected independent dealerships in the entire region. With annual revenue exceeding $6.5 million, my parents visited my business exactly 3 times in all those years. Kevin never visited, except when he needed money. And over the years, he kept needing money for failed business ideas, for Diana's demands for a lifestyle they couldn't actually afford, for loans he never repaid. Every time I refused to lend him more money, my mother would call and remind me that family sticks together and that I had so much, while Kevin was struggling so hard. 2 years ago, something happened that I initially didn't understand correctly. My father, whose health was already severely declining at that point, asked to speak with me. He explained that he'd decided to will me the majority of his shares in a small family property he'd bought decades earlier. One that had significantly increased in value since it was located in an area that had been approved for commercial development. He told me he'd seen how hard I'd worked, while Kevin had never built anything through his own effort, and he wanted to make sure at least part of his estate would end up in responsible hands. I was surprised and deeply moved. I asked him to arrange this properly through legal channels, with a notary, so there would be no doubts or grounds for contest. He did so that same month. The document was notarized, and a copy was filed with my attorney. What I didn't know: Kevin and Diana had found out about this conversation, likely because my father had mentioned it to my mother, who then, probably unintentionally, brought it up in conversation with Kevin. From that moment on, something began to shift in our family. Though I didn't notice it at first, my father died 18 months ago, relatively suddenly, from heart failure. The funeral was painful, but the family seemed to hold together. What I didn't know at the time was that Kevin and Diana had already begun hatching a plan. About 4 months after the funeral, I received a letter from a law firm I didn't recognize. The letter claimed that my father's will, which had transferred the majority shares of the property to me, was invalid because my father allegedly lacked legal capacity at the time of signing, due to supposedly advanced dementia. The letter had been drafted on behalf of Kevin and Diana, who demanded a complete redistribution of the estate, with the goal of taking control of the property and potentially also my dealership, which was partially located on adjacent land that was also part of the original family holding. I was stunned. My father had been mentally sharp right up until his death. I'd spoken with him myself, just weeks before he died, and he'd spoken with razor-sharp clarity about finances, politics, and even the details of his own will. The claim that he'd had dementia was an obvious lie, fabricated to contest a legally valid will. I immediately contacted my own attorney, Mr. Brandt, who had helped draft the original will. He confirmed that my father had been examined by an independent physician regarding his legal capacity at the time of the notarization, a precaution Mr. Brandt himself had recommended, specifically to prevent this kind of challenge. The medical evaluation was safely on file in our records, but Kevin and Diana didn't know that. They'd apparently assumed that a simple lawyer's letter with vague claims would be enough to intimidate me or push me toward an out-of-court settlement, where I'd voluntarily give up part of the inheritance just to avoid litigation. I didn't respond directly to their attorney's letter. Instead, I had my own lawyer draft a formal response, attaching the medical evaluation as well as the complete notarized documentation, making clear that any further attempt to contest the will would be met with a countersuit for attempted fraud and defamation. For a few weeks, there was silence. I thought the matter was settled. I had underestimated Kevin and Diana's desperation, however. About 6 weeks later, I got a call from my operations manager, Mr. Whitman, who had worked for me for 10 years. His voice sounded alarmed. He reported that a woman who'd introduced herself as Diana Roth, co-owner, had shown up at the dealership along with an attorney and a locksmith trying to gain access to the office, claiming she had legal documents proving her ownership rights to the business. I was on a business trip at the time, about 2 hours away. I immediately called my lawyer and at the same time the police to make sure no one gained unauthorized access to my property. Then I drove back at maximum speed. When I arrived, I first sat in my car in the lot across the street, watching the situation while on the phone with my lawyer, who advised me to let the police clarify the situation first before intervening myself. To avoid any possible escalation, I watched as Kevin, Diana, and their attorney, a woman I later identified as a relatively inexperienced lawyer, stood in front of the entrance with a locksmith. The locksmith looked increasingly uncomfortable, clearly sensing something was off about the situation. A legitimate owner would normally have the papers on hand or arrive with the police, not with the locksmith trying to gain access under time pressure to an operating business. 2 patrol cars arrived, called simultaneously by my operations manager and me. The officers asked everyone present to identify themselves and produce the alleged ownership documents. Diana's attorney presented a copy of the disputed, modified will draft, a document that, as it later turned out, had never been notarized and merely represented a one-sided claim, not a legally valid ownership document. At that moment, I got out of my car and walked directly toward the group, accompanied by my own attorney, who had also arrived by then. I presented the officers with the complete notarized documentation, the medical evaluation of my father's legal capacity, and the official business registry listing me as the sole owner of Roth Automotive, independent of the property dispute. The officers examined the documents carefully and quickly determined that Diana's papers had no legal validity whatsoever. One officer clearly explained that attempting to gain access to someone else's business using a locksmith and invalid documents could constitute attempted breaking and entering. Diana went pale. Kevin tried to explain it was a misunderstanding, but the officers weren't impressed. The locksmith, clearly realizing he'd been dragged into a legally questionable situation, immediately packed up his tools and loudly distanced himself from the entire affair before hurriedly leaving the parking lot. I stood calmly and said to Kevin, "You tried to break into my business with fabricated claims and a locksmith. The evaluation confirming our father's legal capacity has been with my lawyer for over a year. Either you didn't research this thoroughly enough, or you hoped I'd simply be intimidated." Kevin had no answer. Diana tried to shift the blame to her attorney, claiming she'd been poorly advised, but the facts were clear. They had knowingly attempted to gain access to my property through fraudulent means. The police filed an official report. My lawyer advised me to additionally file a civil suit for attempted fraud and the wrongful contest of a valid will, to ensure Kevin and Diana wouldn't make any further attempts. Over the following months, the situation continued to deteriorate for my brother. The attorney they'd hired withdrew from the case after realizing how weak their legal position actually was. Kevin and Diana had to bear substantial legal fees for their failed attempt, in addition to the costs resulting from my countersuit. The family property remained rightfully in my possession, exactly as my father had intended. My mother initially tried to mediate between us, but once I laid out the complete facts for her, including that Kevin had tried to force his way into my business with a locksmith, she too understood how far her son had gone. She's spoken noticeably less with Kevin about this since then, and began questioning her own role in years of favoritism. Kevin and Diana filed for personal bankruptcy about 8 months later, overwhelmed by legal costs and their pre-existing debt. I didn't help financially. I'd learned that some people interpret any support as confirmation of their sense of entitlement, rather than as a gift deserving gratitude. Roth Automotive expanded to a second location this past year. I recently integrated my father's property into a commercial expansion, exactly as he probably would have wanted. Today there's a small memorial plaque with his name on the property. A quiet reminder that trust must be earned, and that real family isn't the ones who make the loudest demands, but the ones who actually stand by you when it matters.